Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. I'm simply to talk about Professor Oswald P. Backus, in whose name we have the visiting lecturer in Polish studies. Well, I could say Professor Backus was a scholar, fundraiser, an administrator, but above all, a wonderful person, a wonderful human being. He had a great heart. He always was interested in whoever he was talking to, made them feel that they were the most important person in the world. And he had a deep sense of what is moral, what is ethic, and a spiritual side to him, which those who knew him better were aware of. But he was just one of the most wonderful person that I've ever met in my life, I can say that. So, we have this evening my colleague, now my colleague, used to be my student. I'm very honored to have him. Neal Pease, who will talk on the topic of, I don't know, the destruction of the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Warsaw. All right.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. It's an honor for me to deliver the Oswald Backus Memorial Lecture. I've looked down the list of speakers who have preceded me, and I will make no pretensions to being the most distinguished speaker you have had, but I will guarantee you one thing. You have not had a speaker in this series who is more honored and delighted to have received this invitation, and that is for three reasons. And first of all, as many of you may know, probably because I've been repeating it ad nauseum, to anyone I meet, I sort of grab them by the collar and say, hey, I'm a native, I'm Italian. I grew up here. I have 2 degrees from Kansas. I grew up in a house, 5 minutes walking from here. And it's been a while since we moved away, but Milwaukee is home now, but coming back here is special in a way that no other place can be. That's one reason. The second reason is that it is a chance to get back in touch with my old professor and advisor, Anna Chanchawa, to whom I owe a great deal, on 2 counts, I suppose. First of all, because she took me under her wing when I was an undergraduate and encouraged me to go on in the field. A great favor for me, not necessarily to the field, but we'll let that stand. The second reason, if I understand the story correctly, is that one time when she was visiting Chicago, she convinced my future father-in-law to send her oldest daughter to join the University of Kansas exchange program in Poznań, Poland. And Eva is sitting up here. KU MA 1974, if I recall. The third reason, and not the least important, is that, I knew Oswald Backus. As it happened, I grew up being friends and neighbors with a fair number of people who belonged to the KU Slavic department. Roy and Betty Laird and their kids were practically next door neighbors. Jarek and Maura Piekałkiewicz from political science. And of course the Backuses. Grew up with the Backuses. I knew Professor Backus very well, except to me he wasn't Professor Backus so much. He was Rob's dad, and Fran's, and Penny's, and Ozzy's, and Tony's, and Richie's. And we would hang out in the basement of the house there on Sunset Drive. Rob would sneak us into the Russian Easter parties that were held every spring. Rob and I were debate partners in high school, and you know, lots of things are sort of coming together here. I think, if I remember correctly, it was Rob who first convinced me, I'm taking this course in Polish and Eastern European history. You've got nothing to do. All you're doing is playing bridge. So why don't you take this course with me? It happened to be on a chinchalas, and so you can blame Rob if the lecture turns out to be bad. Okay? But you didn't come here, or at least some of you didn't come here to hear an old grad wax nostalgic about times agone. So let's get started. The 2014 Oswald P. Backus Memorial Lecture, Not a Stone Upon a Stone, the demolition of St. Alexander Nevksy Cathedral in Warsaw. People who know modern Warsaw, if they hear a description of a building that dominates the skyline of the city that is now the capital of the independent Third Polish Republic, described as an architectural monstrosity that is completely out of character with the cityscape of Warsaw, that is furthermore a symbol of subjection to a foreign power, and occasionally insultingly likened to the phallus of a Russian despot, well, people will know that we are talking about the palace of culture and science, or culture and learning, that has graced, if that is the word, the skyline of Warsaw since 1955. It was the infamous gift of the Soviet Union and of Generalissimo Stalin to the Polish People's Republic. However, those same descriptions might have been applied to a building 100 years ago that stood in this spot, which is now the largest public square in Warsaw, just a little bit a ways towards the Vistula River from the Palace of Culture, and it is now known as the Marshal Józef Piłsudski Square, or Piłsudski Square, named after the soldier statesman who is generally regarded as the founding father and first citizen of the independent Second Polish Republic, whose free existence lasted from the end of the First World War until the beginning of the Second World War. Now, some of you will know Piłsudski Square. The main landmarks now are back. Oh dear, that's not what I want to do. I'm not very good at this. Here we go. Over here, the arcade of what used to be the Saxon Palace, which is now the site of the Polish Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and here a large cross installed in memory of a famous appearance there by the son of Poland, Pope John Paul II. But otherwise, the main impression one gets from Piłsudski Square is a vast emptiness. But it wasn't always empty. As a matter of fact, for a while, it was dominated in here by a building that no longer stands. A building whose ghostly outline was revealed in the long submerged foundation that was unearthed during a recent renovation of Piłsudski Square last year, and you can probably see it right here. And it was this building here, the St. Alexander Nevsky Orthodox Cathedral, that stood from 1894 until 1926 in various stages, in construction, in completion, in disrepair and disrepute, and in destruction. And what I want to talk about today is the story of the building of St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral and the controversy that surrounded the question of what should be done with it after Poland recovered independence, after the Russian presence that had been established there, the coming of Russian rule over that part of what had been the Polish Commonwealth, had been expelled by Russian defeat and then collapse in the First World War. Now, before I do this, I want to talk a little bit about a larger issue, which is how one deals with the remnants, the physical remnants and reminders of a despised predecessor regime once that regime is gone. This is a question that has been posed to many countries, many peoples, not simply in Central and Eastern Europe, although it is one that has particular resonance in the post-communist regions of, well, Poland and its neighbors. And if you take a look around Warsaw and other places in Poland today, you can see different ways that these questions have been answered. I mean, it's one thing. It's easy enough simply to change a street sign. Let us say, from commemorating a communist hero deemed worthy of honor during the period of the Polish People's Republic, to one more in keeping with the ethos of democratic Poland. One example would be what used to be called Dzierżyński Square, dominated by a statue of the Pole who was Lenin's chief executioner and the founder of the Czeka back in the day, Felix Dzierżyński. There we go. And what happened to Dzierżyński's statue is the one that you see here, and which you saw played out in many ways over the former Soviet Imperium, usually consisting of the destruction of a statue of Stalin, or Lenin, or Marx, or whatever. Well, here's the toppling of Felix Dzierżyński, and of course, with a certain sense of irony, Dzierżyński Square has become Bank Square, and the place occupied by the statue of the communist hero is now occupied by the 19th century Polish poet of impeccable patriotic credentials, Juliusz Słowacki. Elsewhere, sometimes you can deal with this as an element of mockery or irony, such as the gallery of socialist realist art in the Zamoyski Museum in Kozłówka, elsewhere in Poland. Sometimes the remnants of the old regime have been left in place and simply adapted, into the landscape of the city. Constitution Square in downtown Warsaw is still dominated by the massive this was an area that was supposed to be turned into a proletarian housing district. And now, it's sort of fashionable to take up an apartment or stay in a hotel that harkens back to the old communist days. If you go to the Rondo de Gaulle, at one of the major intersections in the city, you can see this inscription on one of the buildings that harkens back to a slogan from the early communist days when it was necessary to rebuild Warsaw from the rubble of the Second World War. The entire nation is building its capital, rebuilding its capital. It's still there, and people just sort of accept it as part and parcel of the infrastructure of Warsaw. But the example that I want to talk about goes back to this area that is really quite interesting because it has changed names and changed its focus so often in history, and this is the one spot in all of Poland that is most sensitive to the changing power of who rules or governs Poland at a particular time. It has changed names. It has changed architecture with stunning regularity throughout the 20th century. And, you know, you could even, I think, write a history of 20th century Poland using as a focus the sort of changing face and character of the area that is now called Piłsudski Square, but took life as Platz Saski, or Saxon Square, going back to the 18th century. And it was the residence of the Saxon kings in the 18th century. This is the original Saxon palace. The Saxon gardens were in back of it, and over here, actually, you can see it on this map. Here is the Saxon palace. The gardens were here, and if you know Warsaw, here is the main thoroughfare known as Krakowskie Przedmieście, with the old town, the Stare Miasto, over in here. Well, Platz Saski was what it began as, and it was Platz Saski until 1935. This is a picture taken in 1928, but in 1935, after the death of Marshal Piłsudski, who had informally ruled Poland for the last 10 years of his life, Saxon Place was renamed Piłsudski Square. Now, come the Second World War, and come the Wehrmacht, and come the rule of Nazi Germany, Piłsudski Square became Adolf Hitler Platz, and so it was for 5 years or so. Then came the liberation, and that is what Hitler Platz, Piłsudski Square looked like in 1945, as did most of the central city of Warsaw in 1945, completely destroyed. But of course, what happened in Poland at that time was the arrival via Soviet bayonets of communist power, and the communists wanted to remake Poland in their own image, and so they remade what had been Saxon Square, what had been Piłsudski Square, in their image as well, and to them it was Victory Square, the victory of people's power, the nominal victory, catastrophic though it was, of Poland in the Second World War. Now, ironically, since Victory Square was a communist creation, the most famous and transformative moment in the history of Victory Square was a celebration of an entirely different form of power coming from an entirely different source. The open-air mass held by the newly elected Polish Pope, John Paul II, in June of 1979, before a crowd of some 400,000 people, including my wife, who managed to get a ticket to this, whereas her husband did not. I'll get over it someday. It's only been 35 years. You've got to give me time. And of course, many people point to this as the beginning of the end of communism, not only in Poland, but in all of Eastern Europe. And upon the beginning of the Third Polish Republic, it was returned to its present incarnation as Piłsudski Square, as Poland did in so many ways, leaping back over the years of the Second World War, back over the years of the Polish People's Republic, going back to the last incarnation of Poland that was considered legitimate, the Second Polish Republic. Now, I want to talk about this building that stood on Platz Saski, Saxon Square, Piłsudski Square, later Piłsudski Square, as I say, for about, in construction, through destruction, for less than 30 years. Now, Platz Saski, by the end of the 18th century, it already bore the character of a public space dedicated to emphasizing the subjection of Poland to Russian rule. Anybody have any idea what this monument, which stood in Platz Saski, was dedicated to, the forerunner of the Orthodox Cathedral? No. Fine. Then I can tell you anything. It was an obelisk erected by the Russians in memory of Polish officers who had given their lives as loyal servants of the Russian Tsar in trying to put down the Polish revolt of 1830. So that was the monument that was the main feature of Plac Saski up until the later 18th century. And it is at this point in the 1890s that the story of St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral comes into play. And it begins with a correspondence between this gentleman, Count Joseph Gurko, who is the Governor General of Warsaw, Russian, of course, from the 1890s to 1894, and the Tsar at the time, Tsar Alexander III. And it was Gurko who suggested to Alexander III that it would be a good idea to build a new Orthodox cathedral in Warsaw. And the main reason that he gave for this was that it was necessary to provide for the religious needs of 40,000 Orthodox believers resident in Warsaw at the time. A plausible enough reason. And the Tsar said, yes, you're quite right. Now, this being said, it was obvious from the get-go that the motives for building this cathedral were more than simply spiritual. That it was patently as well political, and in a sense to rub the Catholic Poles' noses in the fact of their subjection to Russian authority. I'm not going to read you my PowerPoints. I'm guessing that you can all read these yourselves, but if you see them, you see that it was quite clear, in Russian opinion, that one of the main merits of building a conspicuous new Orthodox cathedral, and to do it in this particular spot, in Plac Saski, had political, symbolic, as well as religious reasons. In short, it was clear, both to the Russians who ruled and to the Poles who were ruled, that this was meant to be as much a political statement as a religious one. And maybe I don't need to emphasize this, but just to make sure everybody understands. We are talking about a time, the late 19th century, about 100 years after an independent Poland had been subjected to tripartite foreign rule, Russia, Germany, the Habsburg Empire. We are also talking about a time when increasingly Catholicism has become central to the notion of Polish identity and patriotism. Orthodoxy is becoming more and more central to Russian notions of identity and patriotism, and the rivalry of religions between West and East, between Catholic and Orthodox, very much mirrored the historic rivalry between Poles and Russians, in which Russians now had the upper hand and were using that upper hand to make sure the Poles understood that there was not to be any future for an independent Polish state. So that's the sort of matrix out of which this is all coming. Anyway, the Tsar gives the go-ahead to build the new cathedral in 1894. The job of constructing it is given to this fellow, prominent Russian architect, Leonty Benoit. He was the scion of a well-known Russian artistic family. He also designed, a few years later, another noted building in Warsaw, the Reduta Bank of Poland, not far away from Piłsudski Square. Actually, he's probably best known for being the grandfather of the actor Peter Ustinov. And I think you can see a little familiar resemblance there, right? So anyway, Benoit was given the job of designing the cathedral and Construction started in 1894, and it took a very, 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 very long time. The interior design, which is often thought of as being of higher quality than the architecture itself, was parceled out to any number of people. Probably the best known of the artists who worked on it was this fellow, Viktor Vosnetsov, who was a well-known Russian artist who worked with mythological, historical, religious themes, and his mosaics of the apostles are considered to be the best artwork to be found in the cathedral. Now, as I say, it took a long time to build. It was completed and consecrated. I apologize for the fuzziness of the picture, but this shows the consecration of the cathedral in 1912. And this is the way it looked in full construction. And what you see here is the cathedral proper over here. And it's facing this way towards the Saxon Palace, towards the Saxon Garden. In other words, Krakowskie Przedmieście is behind it, if you will, over here. If you're looking for any sort of orientation, if you know where what used to be the hotel, the European hotel would have been back here. The Hotel Victoria. Yes, it now stands over here. And this is the second bell tower. These were the tallest structures in Warsaw at the time. The bell tower was 70 meters tall. Opinion on the artistic merit of the cathedral itself varied, to put it kindly. Architecture isn't really my specialty, but I can just tell you that when you sort of look it up in the books, they say, well, it's a very good example of an era of ecclesiastical Russian architecture that is not the most admired. That is, that it bore all the characteristics of what is sometimes called gigantomania. That is a tendency towards mass, a tendency towards ostentation, grandiosity, and not a little bit of Russian imperial triumphalism. In other words, it was the policy of Russia at this point to go around and build Orthodox cathedrals in non-majority Orthodox regions of the empire in the West, again, with largely the same motive as they did in Warsaw, to try to, okay, this is now Russian territory, this is now Orthodox territory, get used to it. This is our future. As I say, opinions on whether it was good architecture or whether it was just pretty nice or god-awful ugly, they varied, and you probably won't be surprised to learn that they varied largely depending on whether you were Polish and Western Christian or whether you were Russian and Orthodox. But anyway, to give you some idea of the way that the cathedral dominated the square, just sort of plopped down in the middle of it. And as you can see, it's very much in harmony with the overall character. I mean, it really, I have nothing against the Orthodox, not at all. But it really, you can't blame people for thinking that it looked like something that was simply plopped down from an alien planet, right? And to the extent that it was understood that that was sort of the intention of it, it was all the more galling. This is, it must have been from an airplane. I'm not sure exactly how, but you can see how it dominates the skyline at this time. Actually, you can read Polish memoirs of the time, and there's this constant theme. They would speak of St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral as this presence, looming, oppressive, unavoidable, that it simply blighted the whole cityscape. And again, if you were a Russian Orthodox, then of course your opinion was different, right? Now, even the namesake of the cathedral was taken by many Poles as a provocation. Alexander Nevsky. Who was Alexander Nevsky? Well, he's a saint of the Orthodox Church, but he was also the prince of Vladimir, Kiev, and Novgorod, who was famous for waging war against Catholic enemies of Russia to the west and extending Russian sway to the west. And he was, in fact, the patron, in Orthodoxy, the patron saint of the Russian frontiers, which were, of course, being steadily moved westward. And there was not a shortage of Russians at the time in the later 19th, early 20th century who thought that it would be the destiny of the empire to move the boundaries still westward further. It was so the whole enterprise of the cathedral was so patently offensive to Polish national sensibilities that there is a persistent story, and it's repeated in almost all of the literature, and it sounds apocryphal, but it's one of those apocryphal stories that, even if it's not true, probably has something going for it, that Saint Johann of Kronstadt, one of the most beloved of Orthodox Russian holy men of the later 19th century, is said to have, well, said this about St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral. When he was asked if he was not pleased that the cathedral had taken shape, that it had finished, he is supposed to have said, well, 5 minutes or so after Russian rule ends over Poland, the cathedral will come down as well. And, it took a little longer than 5 minutes, but as prophecy goes, it wasn't too bad. Now, St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral began its career as the Orthodox Cathedral of Warsaw in full function in 1912, and fulfilled that function for fewer than 3 years. Because, of course, the war came in 1914. And then the Germans came in 1915. Remember, Germany and Russia were fighting on different sides during the First World War. The German army took Warsaw in 1915, and they took Alexander Nevsky Cathedral at the same time. And the Germans turned it, for the duration of the remainder of the war, into a garrison church, no longer serving Orthodox, but serving Lutheran, German Lutherans, and Catholics, whether Polish or German. Then came 1918, the end of the war, and the coming of Polish independence, the arrival of the Second Polish Republic. And the Second Polish Republic had a fair amount on its plate in 1918, to put it mildly. But one of the first questions to arise in national discourse is what is to be done with St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral. One has to understand that this is a question raised in the flush of liberation, in a flush of patriotism, and in a flush of, to make no bones about it, anti-Russian, anti-Orthodox enthusiasm, seeing Russia as having been the chief offender against Poland in the century and a quarter of partition that preceded. There was a wave of closings and demolitions of Orthodox churches, chapels, structures throughout all of the Second Republic, or the conversion of what had been Orthodox religious buildings to Catholic, specifically Eastern Catholic. In a sense, this was a turnabout, I suppose, because many of what had been the Orthodox buildings had been Eastern Catholic, Uniate Catholic, before the coming of the Russians in the 18th century. So it was inevitable that with all of this going on, the fate of the largest, most conspicuous Orthodox church in all of Poland would necessarily come up. Plus the fact that it was this particular church that, for reasons that I assume have been made perfectly clear, was most infamous in the ideas, in the eyes of Polish patriots. However, it was not an easily concluded question. And in fact, what you had was a surprisingly lively and varied debate that broke out in Poland as to what should be done with the building. Should it be preserved? Should it be torn down? Should it be preserved but altered to another purpose? And what you had was a polemic that went on between two parties, and it doesn't translate really well from Polish into English. Let's call them the cathedralites and the anti-cathedralites. That's the best we can do. And from the beginning, the majority opinion rested with the anti-cathedralites, and the most impassioned arguments rested with the anti-cathedralites, and you probably won't be surprised to hear that. And they said that the building had to come down. And they gave lots of reasons. And some of these are kind of boring. They cited reasons of public health. They cited reasons of public safety. They cited aesthetics. Well, that's something to talk about, and we will. But primarily, let's face it, the main motivation that's going on here is a combination religious, patriotic motivation. The Russians built it. The Orthodox built it. They did it over our dead bodies. They forced it on us. Now we're going to get rid of it. Okay. It was usually put in language more diplomatic than that, but that's sort of where it was coming from. Now, let's be honest. One alternative, the chance that it would be restored to its previous function as a cathedral for the Orthodox, that wasn't going to happen. And there were all sorts of reasons for that. For one thing, there were hardly any Orthodox left in Warsaw now. The 40,000 who had been there when the Russians ran the place, well, there were Orthodox, but they were a very small minority whose legitimate religious needs were perfectly well satisfied by existing churches in the city. There was the fact that there were reasons to believe that the building was in disrepair. There was suspicion about the soundness of the foundations. Would it hold? It was also a patent fact that the building was, it had basically been plundered by the Germans. During the war, they had stripped it of much of its decoration that had been, gold or precious metals. The roof, which had been copper, had been stripped as war material, useful to the German war effort. So the roof leaked. There was terrific damage to the interior. So anyway, what you were going to have to do if you were going to restore it as an Orthodox cathedral was that independent Poland was going to have to spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to repair and restore a building that was despised by most Poles for the sake of a handful of remaining Orthodox who were looked upon with great suspicion as unreliable citizens of the New Poland anyway. That simply was not going to happen. However, there were arguments put forward, sometimes by the Orthodox, but sometimes by Poles themselves. Well, maybe the building is worth preserving in some form or another. Okay. Here, we'll move on. In the first place, the argument about the aesthetics of the building. And you actually had a difference of opinion on this, a difference of opinion that exists to this day. As I said, Poles, Western Christians, and Catholics, they generally looked upon it as just an eyesore, a piece of ugliness that nobody would miss. On the other hand, you had experts, some of them Orthodox for the most part, who said it was a splendid building. Somebody even said it was one of the finest buildings built in Europe in the last 1,000 years. I'm not making that up. People said, well, you know, the argument that it's incongruous. Well, the defenders of the cathedral said it was Warsaw's San Marco, that it was the equivalent of the best known example of a Byzantine-style church in an otherwise Western Christian city, San Marco in Venice. Now, this, of course, can be a double-edged sword, since not everybody is convinced that San Marco itself is all that beautiful. I think it was Mark Twain, in Innocents Abroad, who described San Marco as, what is it, a great warty bug squatting on, San Marco Plaza. But anyway, so there was the difference of opinion about aesthetics. But there were possible answers suggested for how can we preserve this building and yet make it useful in a post-Russian independent Poland. Some people suggested what I'm going to call the Pantheon solution. After the examples of, well, you know, the pagan Roman temple that was known as the Pantheon, it was taken over, baptized, and turned into the Christian church that, not officially, but Romans largely came to know it as Santa Maria Rotonda. Another prominent example would be the Hagia Sophia solution. The Church of Holy Wisdom, what had been Constantinople, now Turkish Istanbul, the most splendid church in all of Christendom, was transformed into a mosque by the Turks when they took Constantinople. So there is something you will have to admit about this type of solution that would be the most symbolically complete form of having overcome, of having conquered, of having taken a building originally devoted to one religious purpose, taken over by, if you will, a successor religion. And there were suggestions that you could turn the church into a Roman cathedral, but as you can see, you laughed, and I can see why you laughed. It doesn't quite work, right? It's pretty awkward, and you know, it never got off the drawing board, and people said, no, not worth it. Well, there were people, as I said, Orthodox, national minorities of Orthodox persuasion were the ones who were most invested in preserving the cathedral in some ways. But you also had members of the Polish cultural elite, particularly those identified with the moderate progressive left, who argued, what they said was, if you knock it down, if you just knock it down, then how will the world take this? They will take this as a reflection on the culture of Poland. They will see it as an act of barbarism. They will see it as an act of pure vengeance. We don't want to do this. We can find another way of handling this. Antoni Sonimski, for instance. It was actually the writer Stefan Jaromski who suggested what I'm going to call the Robben Island solution. Robben Island, of course, the famous prison off of Cape Town in South Africa that became notorious as the high-security prison where anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela, were imprisoned. And, of course, in post-apartheid South Africa, has become a museum that is used as a reproach against the former regime.